I'm sorry, if I see a black pilot, I'm going to be like, boy, I hope he's qualified.
When I think back to the days when I thought right wingers like Charlie Kirk made any sense, I become so ashamed of myself. Well, if there's any consolation for me, it wasn't as if they were wrong on the issues they covered back then. It's just that they have become more radical in their stupidity, bigotry, and I dare say racism. Perhaps they've always been this way. They probably tried to recruit as many people as possible into their camp with nuggets of common sense before revealing their true intent. More like bait and switch. But finally, it seems all masks are off. Charlie Kirk and his ilk are progressively revealing who they truly are. Since the Claudine Gay debacle, Charlie and his gang of misfits have taken it upon themselves to attack black people under the guise of combating affirmative action and DEI. So serious was the attack that they even tried to cancel MLK. The last series of attacks seemed to focus on people in the airline industry. And Charlie was not shy to share his thoughts that black people are incompetent in his view in a recent podcast he did with an unnamed character.
And that's why I think this United story and the DEI story
Yes.
hits so hard, because we've all been in the back of a plane when the turbulence hits, or when you're flying through a storm and you're like, I'm so glad I saw the guy with the right stuff and the square jaw get into the cockpit before we took off, and I feel better now thinking
No, I mean,
about
like,
that.
you want
I mean, what the hell is this guy on about? You saw a guy with the right stuff? What does it mean by right stuff? Are there pilots with the wrong stuff? More interestingly, how is a square jaw an indication of the competence of a pilot? Forget about DEI picking pilots for the color of the skin. This guy wants to pick pilots by the squareness of their jaw. Am I the only one noticing this? This dude is complaining that companies are picking pilots based on the physical attributes. At the same time, he wants to pick his own pilots based on the physical attributes of jaw squareness. But of course, the squareness of the jaw is euphemism for white people, specifically white men, which he associates with competence, while DEI is euphemism for black people, which he associates with incompetence. Very reassuring. You literally could not make this up even if you tried. Just after that brain fart of an idea, Charlie Kirk drops the bombshell.
I mean,
about
like,
that.
you want to go thought crime? Like, I'm sorry, if I see a black pilot, I'm going to be like, boy, I hope he's qualified.
You know how right wingers, before their botched attempts at canceling MLK, like to use a quote from his famous I Have a Dream speech? How they like to say, we should judge people based on the content of their character rather than the color of the skin. How they like to preach color blindness and say, we don't see race. But here is Charlie telling us that without knowing anything about the black pilot, his default position is to assume that he or she is incompetent. This is textbook racism. Somehow, Charlie blames his racist tendencies on the left, stating, that's not who I am.
Well, that's the
You
game
wouldn't have
theory
done
I was
that.
talking
You
about.
wouldn't have. You
No,
wouldn't
and
have done
that's
that
not,
before.
That's not an immediate.
No, you wouldn't
that's
have done
not
that
who I
before.
am. That's
No.
not what I believe.
It is the reality the left has
But
created.
I'm
What a rock-solid defense. The left made me into a racist. You know how red pill nuts like to say women lack accountability and would always blame men for the wrong things they do? I think that applies even more to these right-wing nuts. Accountability is their kryptonite. It's always the left's fault that they're acting the way they're acting. They offer no value, no position, no policy proposal, except as an opposition to anything the left holds dear. I mean, how do you build a movement around being constantly reactive? The truth is, Charlie Kirk is brave, but only half brave. He was brave enough to admit to being racist, but he couldn't commit fully to it. He had to blame his racism on the left. I would have had more respect for him if he had just owned his racism with his full chest. That's one of the biggest appeals of Donald Trump. He owns his shit unabashedly. Not surprisingly, self-described theocratic fascist Mouthwash swooped in to give his fellow retard support on Twitter by stating, no, it's not racist. Don't be ridiculous. The point Charlie Kirk is making is that when you hire people based on DEI instead of skill and merit, you create this kind of wariness and suspicion. Does Mouthwash think that DEI is substitute for competence? Is that how DEI works? So when a company says they want to hire a black person for a certain position, does it mean that they don't also take his qualification and competence into consideration? Does he think that any random black person is just put off the streets and given the job because they have to fill diversity quotas? A Twitter troll said, you're forcing people to make assumptions if you hire someone solely because of the color of the skin and don't hire someone else for the same reason. That's racism. We're talking about pilots. They're responsible for hundreds of people's lives. What do you think will happen if a plane crashes, killing everyone, and it comes out that the crew was a diversity hire? That's murder, and that airline will cease to exist. I have a question. Are there people who are hired solely based on the color of the skin and nothing more? Where are they? Is it possible that an employer, a business owner, someone in business for profit would hire employees solely, I mean the operative word here being solely based on the color of the skin? Do you see how stupid and ridiculous this sounds? Now, if you're looking for something fun and exciting to read, check out my crime fiction novel, which features a debate on race and colonialism. Grab a copy and enjoy the read. The link is in the description of the video. I don't care for DEI policies. I think it's a massive distraction, even though it has its place. Like any policy, it can be abused, but this type of extreme hyperbole by right-wingers as if every DEI hire is hired solely based on color of the skin to the exclusion of competence is truly astonishing. I would be on Matt's and Charlie's side if they could actually prove that DEI has led to the consistent hiring of incompetent people. But all they do is hypothesize about perceived incompetence. Let the facts speak for themselves. If not, shut up. The Twitter user I quoted earlier made a self-defeating argument when he stated that if DEI employees lead to the crashing of an airplane, that would be the end of that company. Does he really think that airline companies do not know that? What kind of moron thinks that the owners of an airline will ignore the very risks of hiring incompetent people and hire incompetent people for the sake of diversity? If it sounds as low IQ as it sounds, it's because it is. Besides, these DEI policies did not start yesterday. There have been at least a decade of implementation. Where are the tragedies that has resulted from these DEI policies? Why are right-wingers still arguing on hypotheticals when they could be pointing out real cases? Before DEI was implemented in the airline industry, what was responsible for plane crashes? I mean, those pilots then all had square jaws. Weren't they supposed to be the competent ones? For every plane flown by a square-jawed person that crashed, what was responsible for that level of crass incompetence? Without DEI, how do you get to hire incompetent white people? A Twitter user made an astute observation on this point by stating, if you look at someone you don't know and make assumptions about how they got their job, that's a you problem. You know absolutely nothing about them, but look at the skin color and all those assumptions come to mind. That's not colorblind. And she's right. Except those people mean to say that no black person could ever be competent enough on their own to become a pilot without DEI. If that were true, they would be correct. But it isn't true that no black person can become a pilot without DEI. Yet, the competence of every black pilot, even those who were not hired based on DEI, is called into question without proof, but just for being black. Some may say, well, when they prove themselves to become competent, then we'll acknowledge it. But isn't that akin to saying someone is guilty before proving innocent? Would white people be okay with black people assuming every white person they came across is racist until they prove themselves otherwise? Yet, this is exactly what is being done to black people with this DEI narrative. I can't say DEI has not led to the hiring of incompetent people. It's very possible. Like any policy, implementation is far from perfect. But even without DEI policies, incompetent people have been and are still being hired. Why is that so? What's responsible for hiring incompetent people without DEI? I would be on the side of Charlie and his type if they can show that DEI leads to the hiring of incompetent people any more than would have been hired in a non-DEI setting. If that's proven, then I'll accept that narrative and I dare say fact. But until then, I'll simply chalk this outrage up to right-wing silliness, stupidity, and possibly racism. My verdict is that Charlie is a racist, and the burden of proof is on him to prove it otherwise. You see how that works?